So, I'm going to talk all about the beginning of the Civil War and the rising tensions between the North and the South. I think this is really something that's important to talk about because the Civil War didn't have an instantaneous beginning. It was years and years of conflict that led it to be what it ended up being, and like multiple things that happened that led it to begin. It didn't just start and then all these things happened. So, one of the main reasons that for the beginning of the Civil War was that the North and the South were developing in two really different ways. Um, they were the North was becoming more industrialized, while the South was doing everything in their power to like keep their agrarian based economy. In the North, bigger cities were beginning to develop as well as like factories were being built. And this was changing their economy from relying on agriculture to growing technologically. Another thing that changed in the North was the pouring in of immigrants. Their cities were becoming bigger and bigger, and there was a higher demand for jobs, and the North was just advancing in so many ways, becoming more industrialized. But in the South, life remained deeply rooted in agriculture, and large plantations dominated the economy, and those plantations relied heavily on enslaved labor. Slavery wasn't just something that they used to support their economy, it was a way of life. Southerners were serious about defending it and keeping enslaved labor legal. Many Southerners would say that they fought the Civil War to protect states' rights and so that they can make their own decisions. And they wanted to be free to have control over these decisions, and the national government, they didn't like that the national government would have control. So theoretically, it is true that they were fighting for states' rights, but they were fighting for the states' rights to keep the decision to keep slavery so that they could keep benefiting from it and their economy could keep growing. In 1820, Missouri decided that they wanted to be an official state. And at that time, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. Adding Missouri as a state would disrupt the balance between it. And so they ended up coming to an agreement that would add Missouri as a state, but also Maine. And they would keep this balance, they would keep the half and half balance with Missouri being a slave state and Maine being a free state. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, as well as the Compromise of 1850, both attempted to keep peace between the North and the South, the northern and the southern states. But as America continued to expand west, the question arises like, would the places that they're going become free states or slave states? And this is how, and one example of how the Missouri Compromise became a thing. But the solutions that they came up, obviously, like the compromises, they the solutions from those were only temporary. They didn't last very long. But the idea of popular sovereignty was proposed by Senator Stephen Douglas, and this allowed settlers in a territory to decide for themselves whether they wanted to be a slave state or a free state. And it was the Kansas Nebraska Act, which was named after the two territories that were created because of it. And the idea of popular sovereignty, they created to kind of ensure that they can make their own decisions, but it honestly just led to so much violence. At that time, there were also many abolitionists fighting in the North fighting against slavery. People like Frederick Douglass or Harriet Beecher Stowe really exposed how bad and brutal slavery was. And these were details that people weren't seeing and weren't understanding before they're brought to light if they weren't experiencing it for themselves. So many people in the North didn't understand how bad it was, I guess. And even people in the South didn't know that what was really going on. And some of these abolitionists would write like books or articles, anything about it, just so that it can be seen by everyone. The Supreme Court ruled in the case of Dred Scott versus Stanford that Scott was property and not a citizen of the United States. So obviously, as Supreme Court rulings do, this set a precedent for future rulings, and this decision was seen like viewed as one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court had ever made. And this decision also encouraged Northerners who um, to like they didn't agree with it, and they just didn't believe that it was um, like it had any legal reasoning, like it was terrible legal reasoning, and overall just racist. But at this point where we were in the environment of the United States, there wasn't a really way to bring the two sides back together. Like resolution did not seem like it was going to be a thing that was going to happen. And honestly, the tipping point for the Civil War came with the election of 1860. The two candidates were Abraham Lincoln on the Republican side and Stephen Douglas for the Democrats. And Abraham Lincoln was inevitably elected in 1860, but many Southerners saw this as a direct threat to their way of life, even though in a speech Lincoln did promise not to expand slavery and that he wouldn't be abolishing slavery. Um, but Southerners still like feared that he would abolish it, I guess. But then one by one, the Southern states began to succeed and formed the Confederate States of America. And they also, again, saw this as a means to protect their rights as states and not have fear of decisions being made by the national government, I guess. But inevitably just a way to keep slavery to keep boosting their economy. But on April 12th, 1861, Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, and in the next 4 years of the Civil War, more than 600,000 people or 600,000 lives would be lost in a pursuit to fight for what each side thought that they believed in. But yes, I think that this is such an important topic to talk about because um, obviously the meat of the Civil War is so important, but not a lot of focus gets put on leading up to it, but it was such a significant time period and so much was happening that though the Civil War began on this date, there were so many things leading up to it that really changed the way it fell. So thank you.